Welcome everybody, thank you for joining, and thanks to IH for the invitation to your conference today. I have a big soft spot for IH because I did my CELTA at IH London, I did my Delta at IH Madrid, and I taught at IH Madrid for a long time, so I know what a great organisation it is. So it's a real honour to be here. Our topic today is something that I hope will be new to most of you. Teacher leadership is something that's been around for quite a while, since the 80s, but it's gaining real ground now, particularly in North America. So it might be something that you start to read and hear a bit more about. So we'll go through this session and talk about what it is and what it means for your institution and your professional development. It's not going to be the kind of talk where I give you loads of teaching ideas, but I will be asking you to get involved as we go through. So I hope it's lively enough for you at the end of your day. I'm sure it's been a long day, but a good one. So I think we've got a few polls to start off because I just want to find out a little bit about you before we begin. So Sarah, could I ask you to share the first two polls? There's a question here on your role and how long you've worked in ELT. So I'll just give you a moment to fill those in and we'll see who you are. Okay, and Sarah, when you feel everyone's voted, can you share the results with us? Okay, great. So the vast majority of you are teachers. I hope that 2% who are are still working in ELT in some capacity. And a few teacher trainers, a few coordinators and managers, and a real mix of how long you've worked in ELT, but many of you, more than half, have been involved in ELT for more than 10 years, which is great because I think in many cases, teacher leadership is something that's aimed towards experienced teachers. It doesn't have to be, but I think it's potentially particularly useful if you've been working in ELT for a long time. So I hope that's what you'll find today. And excellent to see that there's no one who doesn't work in ELT. That's a good start. Okay, thank you for that, Sarah. I'd like to begin here in Toronto, Ontario, obviously one of the states of Canada. And what happened in Ontario in 2007 was that the Ontario Teachers Organisation, Teachers Federation, and the Ministry of Education in Ontario got together to decide what they could do to improve professional development for teachers in the state. There were about 4,500 schools in Ontario, so there's a lot of teachers, and there was a real feeling that professional development wasn't particularly useful. There was that kind of sigh when CPD was mentioned to teachers, and so the Ministry of Education came to the Teachers Federation to ask for their help in creating a more kind of teacher-directed and a more of a grassroots solution to professional development in the state. And what ended up happening was that the Ministry of Education there provided funding for around 300 projects. Over the next 5 years, they funded 300 different projects in schools across the state, and any teacher was able to apply for that funding and to get support with a project in their school. The goals of this whole program were to, first of all, to support experienced teachers in continuing to develop, because we know that in many cases it's easy for teachers to kind of plateau, particularly after 3 years. That's a key point in the career where if they're not supported, teachers begin to kind of get a bit fed up. So supporting experienced teachers was one of the goals. Developing teachers' leadership skills in order to enable them to share their practices and get their projects off the ground was another key goal. And then facilitating the exchange of all the learning that was coming out of these projects was the third goal. And it was a huge success. So a few studies were conducted on this program, one after 5 years and another after about 10 years. And researchers from Stanford and the University of Toronto wrote that TLLP, that's what it's called, is an outstanding way of leveraging and developing professional learning for experienced teachers. And they recommended that it continue as long as possible. Sadly, it didn't. The state withdrew funding a couple of years ago. So that's a shame. And it kind of underlines many of the issues that come up when we talk about CPD for teachers, that teachers do need time for their development. Often there's some money involved as well. And that these are the kinds of things that we'll discuss in relation to teacher leadership. But I just wanted to kind of give you this as a kind of example to hang some of the ideas on that we're going to be seeing over the next half an hour or so. So I just want to answer 4 key questions. First of all, what is teacher leadership? Why would you do it? What does it involve? And how can you start doing it if it's something that you're interested in your schools? So what it is a slightly difficult question to answer. So you've got that example from Canada, but even within that program, in each of those 300 different projects, things would have looked slightly different because we know every school is different, every group of teachers is different. In different contexts, you face different challenges. And so the solutions to those challenges are going to be different in every school and for every group of teachers. So specifics when it comes to defining teacher leadership are quite difficult to come by, but I just want to give you 2 definitions to get us going. I'll give you a moment to read this one. Okay, the final few words are the particularly important point here, that when we do this, we're always doing it with the aim of improving student outcomes, student learning outcomes. And of course, we hope that by developing teachers, that's what we get, but it can be easy to lose sight of that ultimate goal. We always want better student learning. So this is the first definition. The second one is this one. So I'll give you a moment to read this too. Okay. So there's a few different themes here in each of these. And just to pick them out, I'm going to check that you were paying attention and see if you can fill in the gaps here in the chat box, please. So what do you feel are the missing words? These are the 2 quotes we've just seen. What are the missing words here? Some of them are the same word, just to give you a clue. So answers in the chat, please. Okay, we've got improve, influence. Anything else? You've definitely got the main ones. I haven't seen the last word come up yet. Okay. Great. So even though this is the last session, you're still on the ball. That's great to see. I'm going to start showing you the answers now. So influence is something that comes up again and again. I think I'll show all the answers and then we'll talk through them. Improve, so you got this one. Learning, influence and improve again, and then beyond the classrooms here. So let's just break this down a little bit. We've got influence there twice. And that That means a couple of things when we talk about teacher leadership. The first thing is to note that quite often teacher leaders don't have a formal role. So teacher leader means someone who is a teacher, but also a leader. So I'm not talking really about academic managers here or coordinators or senior teachers. Those are formal roles, formal leadership roles. And often when you take on one of those roles, what happens is that you are drawn away from the classroom. And you know, that's unavoidable often. It's not the fault of the people in those roles. But teacher leaders are people that are still teaching and whose teaching makes up the bulk of their time. So that means that they don't have a formal role in order to kind of back up the leadership that they want to implement. So it's more about influence than any kind of power that derives from your job title. I hope that makes sense. Improve appears there twice. So improving teaching is a key part of teacher leadership. And it makes sense that improvements to teaching are driven by people that are still teaching. I don't think that's particularly controversial. Obviously, the ultimate aim of those improvements is increased student learning. And that's always the goal. That's why we've got that highlighted. But one of the things that teacher leadership focuses on is the idea of thinking about learning beyond your own classroom. So all of us as teachers are already leaders within the classroom. You kind of lead what happens. That doesn't mean that you're talking all the time or that you're the kind of center of attention all the time, but you are leading what takes place in your classroom. And the idea of teacher leadership is to take that same mindset, but to take responsibility for learning, not just in your classroom, but in your whole school, in your whole institution. And not just your students learning, but your colleagues learning and your own learning as well. So beyond means we're talking about going beyond several different boundaries there. Now, if you're kind of scratching your head at this point and thinking, not sure about this, I can completely understand that because it took me a long time to get my own head around this and to understand leadership from a slightly different perspective. So often when we think of leaders, we think of an individual and an individual with considerable power and influence, probably great charisma. So I don't know who comes to mind, Barack Obama, somebody like that, Julius Caesar maybe. We often have this kind of great man view of leadership. But teacher leadership involves a slightly different take on leadership as a concept, thinking about multiple people being leaders as part of a team, as part of a community. And the best analogy I can really come up with is a football team. You quite often hear footballers talking about being leaders on the pitch, even if they're not necessarily the captain of the team. They're obviously not the manager of the team if they're playing, but it's still possible for a player on the team to take responsibility, take the grain by the scruff of the neck is the cliche that's often used, and drive things forward. And so that's the same idea here for teachers. So in a way, maybe teacher leadership's not the right term for what we're talking about. That's something that's been raised by a few academics because it does give us this idea of an individual being in charge, a bit like a head teacher. And for many teachers, that's an uncomfortable feeling. But that's not really what we're talking about. This is much more a case of improvement through empowerment. That's the title of this paper by Moyes and Harris. And I really like that phrase, improvement through empowerment. I'll just give you a moment to read this. So this is about reclaiming school leadership from the individual to the collective, from the singular to the plural, and working along this model of distributed leadership. So in practice, what that might mean is that teachers in your school take on slightly more of a leadership role, while the senior teacher or the academic manager devolves some of those responsibilities and maybe gets back in the classroom, if they're not there already. I appreciate that's a bit abstract, difficult to envisage right now. Hopefully, as we go through, it will become clearer. So I think this is an important question to answer because you might wonder why you'd want to do this. If it's often an informal role, that means you're probably not getting paid anymore for it. You don't have a change in your job title, and there are challenges that come alongside leadership roles. You might be thinking, why would I do it? But I want you to start answering that question for me. So answers in the chat box, please. What possible reasons do you think there might be for taking on this role as a teacher leader? I'll give you a couple of minutes to put your answers in the chat. Okay, I think that's a nice one, Teresa, to create something special in your school. Every one of those projects that I mentioned in Canada was unique, and so it is quite special actually to create something that doesn't exist anywhere else and that has a difference in your institution. Absolutely, sharing ideas and projects, personal reward. Yeah, it's enormously rewarding to see something that you've driven forward make a difference to your colleagues and to your students. Absolutely, Casa. So one of the big reasons for doing this is to help students learn more and learn better. Yeah, same there for Marina. Let me see if I can just make the chat box bigger. Yeah, Teresita. So maybe you might be genuinely interested in this. I'm that kind of teacher that is just does this because it's interesting for me to do it. And if you are one of those teachers, then that's great. Yeah, and it's often you can share experiences and get feedback from colleagues. And obviously that feedback helps you to become a better teacher, but also to develop these skills of leadership. So if you are thinking of becoming a manager or senior teacher or something like that, you can develop skills towards that. If you're not and you want to stay in the classroom, you can improve your teaching. Better teamwork, absolutely. And Manuela, yeah, to create a better school environment all round, a more democratic, maybe, school environment. Let me give you a few answers here. So the number one reason to do this, in my view, would be to improve student engagement and student outcomes. There was a huge amount of feedback from the Canada project that found that students whose teachers were involved in these projects, those students felt more engaged in their lessons. So obviously the teachers were doing something different, but it did have an influence on student engagement. Your own professional development, as part of your activities as a teacher leader, you will be learning a lot and improving your teaching. You build some really strong relationships with the colleagues that you work with on these projects. And those might be colleagues in your own school, or they might be colleagues outside the school, in the region, or maybe in teaching organizations, teaching associations, or more widely, maybe online. Maybe you've got an online teacher leadership project. You can have some influence at the level of your school, at institutional level, and hopefully that's a good thing in terms of improving things, improving the way that the school is run. Without casting aspersions on teachers, staff rooms can sometimes be quite moany places. Sometimes you need that as a teacher. You come out of the class and you've had a difficult lesson and you just want to have a bit of a whinge. It's cathartic, isn't it? But teacher leadership provides a route for actually changing things. So, I used to work in a school where we had CD players in every classroom, and the management bought the absolute cheapest CD players they could possibly buy. So they were very, very quiet. People at the back of the classroom couldn't hear the audio, and they broke down all the time. So that's the kind of quite small but potentially significant thing that you might begin to start changing. And I'm sure it can move beyond that into more profound changes than just CD players, but you might be able to start having an influence at school level. Recognition from your peers and the institution, and potentially more widely as well. And a lot of reward, a lot of motivation and satisfaction from doing these things. So plenty of reasons to do it. I think all of these become a little bit more relevant if you have been teaching for a long time. It can be difficult, when you've been teaching for over 10 years and you attend another CPD session. Sometimes it's quite hard to get anything new from sessions like that. And so getting involved and being proactive about finding new routes to professional development is probably even more rewarding if you have been teaching for a long time. But I think everything here applies to teachers, however long you've been teaching, even if you're a new teacher. So what does it involve? There was a separate study done at schools in New England, in the States. And the researchers in that study found that teacher leaders were engaging in all of these activities. So there's quite a few to read here. Confusingly, this goes anti-clockwise from A at the top. So I'll give you a minute to read these. As you read, see if you can group these activities. And afterwards, I'll ask you to share what groupings you identified. So I'll just give you a minute to read these. Let me know if you can identify any groups in these activities. Okay, that's interesting, Teresa. Why have you grouped those together? Manuela's got IHG. That's fine. So those are the things that you personally would like to do, Teresa. Okay. Marina's got C, D, E, H, G. So there are different ways of looking at this. I kind of set you that task just to encourage you to, as a kind of reading task, really. But for me, I think there are three different groups of activities here. Manuela said A, B. So, and then Fabiola says D, E, H, because they all involve cooperation. Okay, I think Lyubov's the one who's got the same reading as me. Let me share what I've got. So A, B, and C are all about the individual teacher. I've called it leading in the classroom, but this is the individual teacher focusing on their own teaching and and eventually they share what they've done, but they're talking about their own teaching, what happens in their own classroom. So that's ABC. D, E, F, and G are what about leading in the school. So in your immediate community, sharing things with teachers, not so much sharing, in fact, working with other teachers to create new solutions, to improve things in the school environment. And then finally, you go beyond the school and you're leading in the community. So in a way, I mean, the way this is set up suggests that you start at A and then you kind of work your way around, which is logical. I don't think it has to work that way every time. You know, for example, you might share work in professional organizations at any point, or you might collaborate with parents, you know, at any point. So it doesn't have to be a kind of step-by-step ladder, but I think this is a useful way of thinking about the different activities that you might take part in. If any of you are familiar with Duncan Ford's book, The Developing Teacher, he has a similar model of development activity that you start with yourself, then your students, so still within your classroom, then your school, and then outside the school to the wider teaching community. So these are the things that a teacher leader might take part in. So final section, let's talk about how you could actually start doing this. And I'll take the first few of those stages to structure this section. So first we can talk about how you might improve your own teaching. Then we might talk about how you could share what you've done and collaborate with colleagues. So what you see on your screen is one of the Cambridge University Press white papers or insight papers. You can find all of these and download them for free at cambridge.org/insights. And this one is particularly relevant right now, I think. So this is a paper written by Silvana Richardson and Gabriel Diaz-Maggioli, all about the principles of effective professional development. And one of the things they found is that teachers learn through doing. To me, this is the whole coronavirus crisis has really exemplified this, because all of us were kind of dumped into online teaching. I think probably for 99% of teachers with no experience of doing it before. And so there was no choice but to learn by doing. To tackle real issues. I'm sure you can think of many issues that you've had with your online classes, and develop practical solutions. So this is what improving your own practice in your classroom looks like. And I'm sure it's something that you've been doing over the last 6 months in abundance, not necessarily because you are you know, a dedicated professional. I'm sure you are a dedicated professional, but more because you haven't had a choice. You know, this was the only way that we were able to do things. We had to learn by doing. If you want to take a more structured approach to this, then there's a kind of sequence that we can follow, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of these steps. But you begin by identifying an issue, and then coming up with a number of possible solutions. You might do that yourself. You might do that by talking to colleagues. You might do it by looking online. You might do it by reading books. There are lots of ways that you could find solutions. But you have a problem, and then you find different ways that you might be able to solve that problem. The next thing is to experiment in the class, reflect on the results of those experiments, and then you might tweak things and experiment again and reflect again, and so on. So I'm sure you might have seen Kolb's cycle of experiential learning, or Penny Ower has a similar cycle of reflective practice in her book. But this is the kind of process that we need to go through as teachers, and it needs to become a habit, really. This is something that never ends. You can always improve things. So although we've talked about an issue, it might not necessarily be something that's really going wrong, that's going badly wrong in your classes. You might just think that there are better ways of doing things, or you might just feel that you've been doing things in the same way for a long time and you want to mix it up. So it's about improving, finding improvements, not necessarily fixing things that are completely terrible to begin with. The word reflect appears here twice, and reflection is not always something that's it's not always obvious how to reflect or even what it is. So I just want to see what you think reflection is. If you had to kind of tell me what reflection means to you, what would you say? Answers in the chat, please. So this might be a definition. It might be what you do when you reflect. Let me know. I'll just give you a minute to type your answers. Okay, so Kate says, looking back at what went well and what can be improved. What worked and what didn't. Thinking over something. Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad way of talking about it, but it's accurate, isn't it? It's about thinking about things. Honestly revising what's happened. I think that's important, actually, Teresita. Often, reflection is often included as part of assessed courses. So on the CELTA, you have to reflect. On the Delta, you have to reflect. And what's very important is that you reflect honestly and you talk about what didn't go well just as much as what did go well. I think some teachers feel that they have to present themselves in a really good light because they're being assessed. And so that's not really reflection. And other teachers just say it was terrible, it was rubbish. They have such a downbeat view of their own teaching. And that's also not really reflection. So it should be a balanced thing. Casa, I like that. Stop, take your breath and start again. Okay, yeah, I think we're on the same page, which is great. So I would say reflection is a process of remembering what happened. This is quite important, I think. If you ever observe somebody and then have that feedback discussion after the observation, quite a lot of the sticking points come because you've got different memories of what took place or different perspectives on what took place. That's why it can be very useful to have something like video, some kind of evidence from the lesson. So remembering what happened sounds simple. It's not actually always as simple as it sounds. But that's the first process. You need to remember what happened in order to reflect on it. Decide if it was successful or not. And successful is a loaded term because success for whom? Hopefully, we're thinking of success in terms of student learning. So was it successful in terms of the students learning what we wanted them to learn or learning something else? And why? And then deciding what to do better in the future. So as I say, I think we're on the same page there, which is great. I just got a few example questions that we might ask ourselves in order to reflect here. So I'll just give you 30 seconds this time. Quick answers in the chat box. What do you think are the missing words? Okay, yeah. So what did the students learn because of the lesson? I quite like your answer though, Lyubov. What did they gain? What have they added to their skills or their knowledge because of the lesson? I think that's just as appropriate. How about the second box, second gap? Yeah, what did the students manage to accomplish? I like that, Joanna, because it suggests that they had to do something. It's not enough to just to practice or to feel more confident. That, you know, what did they accomplish? What did they? It should be something significant. Great. So we've got evidence. What evidence do I have that the students learned? That's really important. What did we hear from the students? What did they write that we can look at? What questions did they ask that suggested learning? Absolutely crucial to look for evidence of learning. Great. I'm going to reveal the answers here. Interesting. So Sonia says, what did I learn about myself in this lesson? Which is also, I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, because it's not just about your teaching, is it? You know, you're a human being as well. There's an example I'll come back to a little bit later where a teacher does learn about themselves in a lesson. And Elena says, what did I learn about my performance in this lesson? Which is also, that's a broader term, isn't it, than teaching? Which is all, yeah, so I quite like that too. Fabulous. All right, there's a bit more to get through, but I want to move on to collaboration. And I think we've got a couple more polls here, Sarah. If you could pop those up for me, that would be great. So collaboration obviously involves other people, so you need to be in contact with other people. And I'm interested in how much contact you have with colleagues now compared to pre-COVID. So 3 questions here. I'll give you a minute to answer those. Okay, and Sarah, when you feel that the answers have stopped coming in, if you could share the results for us. Thanks very much. Okay, so pre-COVID, you might have spoken to between 5 and 10 colleagues, although some of you spoke to none. I don't know, maybe you're doing in-company classes, traveling around on your own. And now in a typical teaching day, that's clearly gone down, hasn't it? So you have a lot less contact with colleagues now. Not surprising, although I do think that's a bit sad. And it makes it harder, definitely, to collaborate, and harder to share ideas, harder to have those conversations where you just get something off your chest. Yeah, that's a shame. What are your main modes of contact now? I thought it would be WhatsApp, but quite a few emails as well, and quite a few video calls. Good to see that a quarter of you are still having face-to-face conversations, though. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind as we go through this next section, this final section. I'm just going to talk about, well, we've got a few minutes. I'm going to talk about collaboration with teachers. Obviously, if you're not seeing people as often, or if you're not seeing as many people, collaboration becomes a lot harder. But I'll leave it with you just to consider how you could do this under the present circumstances. You know, is WhatsApp the best way forward? Is Zoom the best way forward? If you're anything like me, you don't really want to add to your Zoom time. So that, that's something for you to consider and for your colleagues to consider. But collaboration this is a central component of teacher development. We know this, there's lots and lots of research into this. Collaboration encourages creativity, professionalism, and student achievement. And this is quite important. Collaboration improves the ability to initiate and implement change. And that's relevant to change in your own classroom, but also change in your institution. So it's a really important tool for improving teaching and improving schooling, improving outcomes across a whole institution. I'm not going to ask you this just because we're running out of time, but I will assume that you have in the past done at least one of these. So reading groups, if you're not familiar with those, involve somebody sharing a piece of reading, so maybe an article, it might be a piece of lesson material, it might be the results of a study, but sharing a piece of reading and then you get together to discuss it. It's a fabulous thing to do with your colleagues if you've got the opportunity. And a great way in, it's quite a nice, if you're looking to move towards teacher training, it's a nice non-threatening way of kind of starting out, finding something to read and then leading that discussion. Collaborative inquiry, this is kind of action research, if you're familiar with that term, but working with others. So taking that cycle of finding an issue, looking for solutions, experimenting with solutions in the classroom and reflecting on them. It's kind of the same thing, but working together with colleagues to do that. And you might combine that with peer observation in order to help you reflect on the results. So that can be very effective. But it's usually the last one, critical incidents, that nobody's heard of before. So I just want to finish by telling you about those. A critical incident is something that takes place in a lesson. So the idea is you decide to do this and then you go and teach for, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks. And as you teach, you're kind of keeping an eye out for critical incidents. They might be something, it could be something that's quite dramatic, or it could be something that's fairly routine actually and fairly mundane. And often the most meaningful critical incidents are the things that you wouldn't even think to mention because it's so normal. I've got an example in a moment. This whole idea of critical incidents is outlined in a book by a man called David Tripp. I can't remember what the book's called, but you'll be able to find it if you search for David Tripp critical incidents. It's in my references actually at the end, and it's a fabulous, fabulous book. He's got, I think, about 60 or 70 critical incidents in the book. So one of the more dramatic ones is that students are lining up outside a classroom, and a student in the line spits on the floor in front of the teacher. And of course, the teacher then has to decide how to deal with this in front of the other students before the lesson's even begun. There's another critical incident in which he explains that the class is having a discussion, they're talking about something, and then the discussion ends and they move on. And about 5 or 10 minutes later, a boy who doesn't normally speak in this class puts his hand up and says something in relation to that previous discussion. And at the time, the teacher says, why are you saying that now? We've moved on. Keep up. So it's quite an abrupt response. And he goes through and analyzes his response and analyzes what happened. And this is the time where he kind of learns about himself. I think that was your comment, Sonia, earlier. He learned something about himself in his response, in thinking about his response to this student, because he knows it wasn't the right response to give. So it's all about thinking of these things and then analyzing them and thinking about what they reveal about your underlying beliefs. So it's more to do with beliefs than it is to do with, well, I suppose it's to do with how your beliefs relate to your practices. So one example is Mary raised her hand and asked to sharpen her pencil. Completely unremarkable event in the classroom. There's nothing, you would think there's nothing special about this. But he kind of goes through and invites you to think about what this says, what does this mean in the context of the school? And what does it mean in the kind of wider educational context? And what does that mean in terms of our beliefs? So sadly, I don't have time to explain this in detail, but the idea is that an incident becomes a critical incident because we critique it. So finding something quite normal from your classroom or from your lessons, or maybe from the staff room, doesn't have to be a teaching thing. Thinking about that, trying to explain it in terms of the immediate context, and then in terms of a more kind of general educational context as well. And the outcome in this case is that he comes to the realization that he's got this belief: I think students should be more responsible for their behavior in school. I'll share this. I can share the slides with you and my email address. I'll put my email address on the screen in the chat as well, if you want to learn more. I appreciate that's a very rambly, quick discussion of critical incidents. But just to summarize, the goal of teacher leadership is improve student learning through empowerment of teachers. So it doesn't mean that you take on the role of ADOS for free. It means that you and your colleagues are empowered by the leaders in your school to kind of take on this role a little bit more and to do it together, so that you're working together as a community to drive the school forward, rather than individuals taking that responsibility. And you do that by starting in your own classroom and then working outwards. And because of that, teacher leadership will take different forms in different schools. Depends on the size of your school, depends on the age of your students. It depends on what the unique challenges that you face. Maybe you're teaching online, maybe you're teaching face-to-face. It will always take a different form. But I hope you've seen enough to want to inquire further. I do work for Cambridge, so I'm going to plug a book that's relevant here. This is one of our pocket books, so they're quite nice, small books, and the price is small too. But Jack Rich's 50 Tips for Teacher Development has lots of ideas that you could implement as part of a teacher leadership approach, including critical incidents. And some of these collaborative practices that I mentioned. Finally, these are my references, so I didn't make it up. But I'll share these, as I say, I'll share the slides. And if you have any questions, you're very welcome to send me an email or to ask me now. I don't know if we've got time, Sarah. I'll pass back to you.
Yes, we do have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat box. So put your questions in the, not the chat box, the Q&A, sorry, if you have any. So thank you for that, Matt. There's a lot to take in there. So I'm glad you're going to share your slides with us. Something that really resonated with me was that quote, the real possibility of distributed leadership in action. I think that's really important at all sorts of levels, not just with teachers, but on the management side of things too.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that was quite interesting. So it does look like we've got something in the Q&A.
Oh, hello, I'm going to read the question out loud. Do you think teaching leadership can be learned? Is charisma something learnable? I don't really think so. I'm not sure, says Manuela.
Okay, thanks, Manuela. I definitely think leadership can be learned. I don't know how much charisma can be learned, but I think there's a lot more to leadership than just charisma. So there are many, a lot of skills and techniques that are involved in leadership that can be learned, but also a lot that teachers already have. If you're an effective teacher in the classroom, you're already a leader in that community that you have in your own classroom. And so often it's, I think the first step for teachers is to recognize the skills they already have.
Thanks, Matt. Are there any more? I don't think so. Oh, or another one. He says thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks again to you, Sarah, for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Matt.